In 2008, the EPA began coming up with concrete solutions for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And one of these solutions involved a tax on carbon emissions. When applied to beef producers, it meant they may have to pay an annual tax of $88 for each cow they own. Not surprisingly, beef producers were outraged, but environmentalists saw it as reasonable action, given the carbon footprint of beef production. The tax wasn't meant to penalize people for owning cows, but for the greenhouse gas emissions those cattle are responsible for emitting. A tax would also be applied to hogs, but would only be about $22 per hog, because in any year a hog emits less greenhouse gas emissions than a beef cow. By the way, if you are confused as to why I say greenhouse gas in one breath but the word carbon in another, it is because when we measure and report emissions of greenhouse gases, we usually state them in terms of their carbon dioxide equivalent. For example, methane has about 21 times the global warming effect as carbon dioxide. So when we report 1 ton of methane, we often refer to it as 21 tons of carbon dioxide. Most of the time, when we measure the carbon emissions of something, we are referring to the equivalent tons of carbon dioxide. This is why we say carbon footprint when we refer to an impact on global warming. The idea of a carbon tax applied to agriculture is relatively simple. If beef production resulted in a certain amount of greenhouse gas emissions, and those emissions imposed a cost on the population today as well as future generations, beef producers should compensate society by paying a tax equal to those costs. If you are for a carbon tax, that is the justification you might use. This way, the animal would only be raised if society valued the food it produced more than the pollution it caused. That's how markets work. They only sell things to consumers when consumers are willing to pay more than what it costs to produce. Of course, estimating the appropriate tax rate is difficult. It requires knowing, 1, the amount of greenhouse gas emitted from each animal, and 2, the damages those emissions impose on society. Estimating the second part is more guesswork than science, but it is impossible to construct a rational solution to global warming without coming up with some number for the cost of carbon emissions. The EPA has proposed a tax of $44 per ton of emissions. But measuring the first part, the emissions from an animal, can be done with more scientific rigor. Scientists can measure greenhouse gas emissions from cattle by enclosing them in a container that traps all the emissions from the cow while also bringing in fresh air for the cow to breathe. An example of such a contraption is shown here. This is a cow whose head was kept inside of a chamber for a period of time. The cow could still stand up if she wanted, and she wasn't kept in the chamber for very long. It didn't hurt her, and she could still find a comfortable resting position. This chamber was designed to deliver fresh air for the cow and to capture all the air leaving the chamber, thereby enabling researchers to measure all the greenhouse gases emitted from the cow's head. It turns out that cattle emit a good deal of methane, a greenhouse gas. So you may be wondering why her head and not her rear is in a chamber. It turns out that it is the head, not the rear of the cow, where most greenhouse gas emissions emanate from. It is the burps, not the farts of the cow, that emit the most methane, and cows burp about once a minute. Because researchers have developed such scientific tools for measuring the carbon footprint of food, we have a decent, though imperfect, picture of what the carbon footprint of different foods looks like. The reason beef is separated from other foods in this lecture's title is because beef is often associated with a high carbon footprint relative to other foods. And there's considerable controversy right now over whether conventional beef has a lower or higher carbon footprint than grass-fed beef. The article assigned to you is about more than beef and carbon, however. It asks whether organic food has a lower carbon footprint. It reports the relative footprint of chicken, pork, and other foods, and it provides some practical advice on reducing your carbon footprint by changes in your diet and spending habits. I'm hoping that the reading will give you a better idea of the relationship between your diet and your carbon footprint. some of the controversies regarding the carbon footprint of food, and how to think about reducing one's carbon footprint if you choose to do so.